Welcome back to CannaWeek, brought to you by New Frontier Data, where we deliver top headlines in cannabis and hear experts weigh in on the impact these stories are having on the industry. I'm your host, Abby Kaufman. To help cultivate this week's conversation on sustainability and cannabis cultivation, we are joined by Derek Smith, the Executive Director and co-founder of Resource Innovation Institute, a national nonprofit whose mission is to promote and quantify energy, carbon, and water conservation in the cannabis industry. Derek, welcome to CannaWeek.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And along with Derek, we are also joined by New Frontier Data's Chief Knowledge Officer and in-house expert, John Kagia.
Delighted to be
John,
back.
welcome. Thank you. So WaterTech Online recently published an article citing that US legal cannabis water use to almost double by 2025, claiming that a new report, Cannabis H20, Water Use and Sustainability in Cannabis Cultivation, produced by Resource Innovation Institute, Berkeley Cannabis Research Center, and New Frontier Data, gives us some insight into water use in the regulated cannabis cultivation market. So, Derek, considering your company's significant involvement in this report, I wanted to ask, with the current state of the cannabis industry, why water and why now?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on. And I just want to commend New Frontier for looking at these ranges of issues they're very important in today's market. And we know that producers are facing a lot of pressure from a lot of different angles, regulation, the need to reduce costs, to compete, pressures to report on how they're performing from a cost perspective and energy use perspective or water use perspective. So these issues are not going away, and they're only growing. And it's within the context that we're in as humanity, right? Where climate change is an issue and water scarcity is not only on the horizon, it's a reality in many parts of the world, including some key cultivation markets. And so paying attention to water issues, integrating them into business planning, and finding out the best ways to be successful in terms of using water as a key element in production is really critical for the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sums it up quite well. John, is there anything you'd like to add as to why measuring water use is an important priority, specifically like in this day and age?
Yeah, just building on what Derek has said, one of the things that I think is such a unique privilege of the legal cannabis economy is that we get to explore these issues and better understand them at the infancy of this industry. And unlike so many other sectors where you already have the superstructure built, these industries have already achieved massive scale before they begin to tackle the issues of sustainability because of how long these other sectors have been in place. Cannabis as a newly emerging market is, I think, very uniquely positioned to tackle these questions now. And if we think about the fact that, on the adult use side of the sector, while we're, about 15 states have now legalized adult use, but really only about half of those have really began to operationalize their markets. And we have another likely dozen or so that will legalize over the next little while. There's a lot of new capacity that's going to be built over the next 5 to 10 years. And so if all of these new producers that are going to be coming online are able to integrate the kind of insights on efficiency and more and integrate this into their design and infrastructure capacity building, then the long-term benefits and long-term savings for the sector could be huge, both from a sustainability standpoint, but also from a cost of operations standpoint. So, it's always much easier to bake these sorts of solutions into the market at the outset rather than trying to do it once both infrastructure has been built and operational practices are in place. And so, part of the appeal for us here is if we're helping the industry operate more efficiently through our market intelligence from the outset, I think this is a really, really timely kind of issue and an extraordinary privilege to be able to do it this early at the advent of the industry.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I couldn't echo that more strongly. And I would just say that this is exactly why Resource Innovation Institute was formed as a nonprofit 5 years ago, as we saw having the experience in other sectors and knowing how to pull the levers in the market where you can capture data, inform market actors, find common ground on best practices, educate the market, and ultimately have the ability to, from all of that information, identify leadership performance and provide, recognition on leadership performance is really what we are all about, and helping producers connect to resources that can help them be more efficient. And we saw the opportunity that exactly John is talking about, that, wow, how often does an entire industry just come along and establish an infrastructure sort of from at scale from the beginning? And we're still really at the early stage of that. And we have such an opportunity to get this right and not just be, another industry that, kind of retrofits its way to being more sustainable, but actually can start from the ground up and work together and figure this out, and for the benefit of everybody involved. And I think that cannabis just has such a huge opportunity to continue to build its reputation as a responsible market actor by focusing on these environmental issues in a collective, collaborative way.
Absolutely. It's such important work. And to go back to something that John mentioned, he touched on the different stages of maturity of different markets. There's just as much diversity when it comes to water use in the cannabis industry as far as cultivation. So Derek, can you give us a bit of insight into the range of practices involving water use in the cannabis industry with cultivation?
Yeah, so I mean, if you think about water flows through cannabis farms or facilities, pretty much through the entire cultivation process. So the way it's sourced could be from a public source, a well, could be a municipal system, could be a water right from a nearby stream. Then how it's brought into the facility, if it's stored on site, sometimes storage is required by regulation. Might need to be treated or filtered as it's brought in to improve the quality. And then from there, it's applied, it's used for fertigation, delivery of nutrients, and then it continues through the process and is ultimately discharged or as runoff in an outdoor setting, and can be recirculated. So there's plenty of opportunities all along that flow to be more efficient in the way water is used.
Absolutely. Are there any particular types of efficiencies that come to mind with that?
Yeah, the irrigation techniques, I think, is one key area. We note that estimates that came from our water working group that helped us pull together all the content for the water report indicate that you can save 30 to 70% just from going from an inefficient hand watering scenario to a more precise drip irrigation scenario. And then, the recirculation, I think, is a really interesting topic, and it's something that we're going to be studying with USDA funding in non-cannabis sectors. And we hope to bring the knowledge from other agricultural sectors back to cannabis. And we're already seeing recirculation happening quite a bit. There's a lot of great case studies and examples out there, and it's a huge opportunity to capture data and shine a light on those good practices so that it can become industry standard practice, and cultivators can learn from each other and all, improve the industry's footprint overall.
Absolutely. And so the next question I'll throw to John, since conventional wisdom is that cannabis is a rather thirsty plant, but this report paints a different picture. And so I'll start with John, since Derek, I know that your company is very in the sustainability and efficiency. So John, were you surprised by the findings in working with this report about the amount of water that cannabis cultivation requires compared to other crops?
I was, and this is such a complex topic that we obviously had some challenges trying to get our hands around how much water the industry is using writ large to produce the cannabis in the space. So just kudos to Derek and the water working group that he assembled, who provided invaluable context into helping us understand this. But based on the modeling that we did, one of the, pardon my expression, holy crap moments I had when we were working on this was when we finally kind of put up our estimated total use of water in California, which is the country's largest cannabis producer, produces more than half of the total cannabis consumed in the country, against other major California agricultural crops. And seeing that like the orchard economy in California uses nearly 7 million acre feet of water. Acre feet is a measurement, but suffice it to say, the orchard economy uses a phenomenal amount of water. Per the state's reporting, it is the largest water use sector in California's agricultural economy. Rice uses roughly 5 million acre feet. Cannabis uses 3,000 acre feet. So despite the value that the industry represents, and cannabis is California's most lucrative cash crop when you combine the legal and illicit sectors, its comparative water use is just a magnitude of order lower. And so while, I think there was a lot of mistaken assumptions because of how much revenue the industry was generating, that equated to a massive amount of resource use to produce it. But I think what that didn't account for is just how lucrative cannabis is per gram, per ounce, per pound. And you compare an ounce of cannabis or a pound of cannabis at $1,500 to $3,000 per pound versus a pound of corn at less than 10 cents. Then the economics in terms of the poundage that you need to produce to create a multi-billion-dollar industry is just vastly different. So being able to finally put a spotlight on this delta between how much revenue the industry is generating versus how much crop is actually required to generate that revenue helped contextualize why the total footprint of cannabis is so dramatically lower than other agricultural crops in the state.
Absolutely. And so Derek, I know that or it may be a false assumption, but I'm assuming you weren't as surprised by the findings. But if you were not, were there any other types of findings over the course of developing this report that were surprising to you?
Yeah, well, I think just to go back to the reason for the report was that we knew that good information about water usage and like a good benchmark or a baseline understanding of how much this plant actually, requires, just not available, or really there was only one statistic that was cited. And we had heard from many places in the market that number was not just incorrect, but kind of wildly incorrect. And we've come to find that this understanding of the plant as consuming 6 gallons per plant per day actually came from an extreme part of a model that the California Department of Food and Fish and Wildlife used to assess the illicit market. And again, it was an extreme data point, and it became such that it was the only sort of data point out in the atmosphere that a media outlet could grab onto. And so it became what sort of the native wisdom of how much this plant consumes. But yet, again, we had heard from all parts of the industry that, and even government sources, that it was not anywhere near that. It was less than a gallon per plant per day. But even just thinking about it as a metric based on a per plant basis is a really inappropriate way to evaluate the productivity and efficiency of these practices and this plant.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Particularly, you brought up the illicit market, and I would imagine that the illicit cannabis market versus the legal one probably has significantly different cultivation practices as far as water usage. So speaking of that, how does water use in the regulated cannabis cultivation market compare to that of the illicit one? Derek?
Well, the regulated market is just increasingly more efficient in and of itself, just because it's becoming a more mature market. And the illicit market obviously doesn't have to deal with the burdens of compliance costs and everything else. And so it has a margin difference and can afford to waste resources, unfortunately. And so what we're seeing is increasing efficiency, increasing understanding of the importance of tracking and measuring and improving performance over time. So we're really heartened by the direction, but we know there's a lot more that can be done, and best practices are still need to be fine-tuned and spread throughout the industry.
Absolutely. John, is there anything that you'd like to add about the differences between regulated cannabis cultivation versus the illicit market?
Yeah, so it's been interesting to as we're going through this process, learning at kind of this phased approach that's evolving as the market is making the transition from unregulated to legal and regulated. So I was just stunned by hearing the ways in which water gets wasted in the unregulated market. As Derek said, there's very little incentive in the unregulated market when you can charge whatever you can. To be efficient in your resource use. So whether that's using inefficient techniques like just hand watering the hose and not turning the hose off between plants. So you end up getting as much water on the ground as you do into the pots. Just the transition from hand watering with a hose to drip irrigation is a massive step forward, and drip irrigation is almost now the new baseline for the regulated market, even though drip irrigation in and of itself barely scratches the surface of some of the water efficiency gains that is still yet to be made in the sector.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and then just kind of beyond that, and Derek had mentioned these earlier, the reclamation and recirculation. Again, one of the findings that I had not really understood the scale at which it represented as a point of efficiency gains is the reclamation of HVAC, HVAC condensate. So water plants emit about 90% of the water that they absorb through evapotranspiration, which is how they cool their leaves. And so in an enclosed environment, in a greenhouse or in an indoor structure, that's getting absorbed as humidity or as condensate in the HVAC system. And all of that is water that can be reused. And so if this is 90+% of the water that the plant is absorbing, and in a facility that is not reclaiming condensate, all of that is literally just being flushed down the drain. The fact that there are now systems that allow you to not only capture that water, but process it, purify it, and get it ready for recirculation means that you can dramatically lower your fresh water requirement because you're just literally feeding the plants back the water that they've put out into the ambient environment. And so these are sorts of technologies or solutions that the unregulated market would have very little incentive to invest in, but in an increasingly price competitive environment where cutting down your water bill by 60, 70, 80% can have phenomenal impact on your bottom line. Then the ROI of these investments do add up, and we've been heartened to see the number of cultivators who are increasingly integrating these sorts of technologies into their operations.
That's wonderful. So to continue on about the illicit market for a moment, the report notes that the illicit market will be the primary driver of water use in the cannabis industry over the next 5 years. So Derek, how do you feel that stat will impact the conversation regarding not only sustainability, but also regulation of cannabis?
I appreciate the question very much. And I'll just say that I'm based in Oregon, and we have great ongoing dialogues with the legislators here about the very real fact that if states want to protect the tax revenues from the regulated markets that are providing a lot of support for services in local communities, that it is absolutely in their best interest to help the regulated market be more efficient. So in other words, invest in the industry, help it know how to be more efficient, help it adopt practices and technologies, and get training to know how to most effectively use those technologies. And that will come back to those governments in the form of tax proceeds, especially when the state walls come down, right? And Oregon becomes competing globally. And so I think that's one key element of how the public sector can support the regulated market and help it outcompete the illicit market through essentially an investment in it. And of course, doing that also provides, shields the rest of the needs for resources throughout, these markets or agricultural communities that cannabis is placed within. And it's all really important just to understand that this is an agricultural crop. It should be considered agriculture and not some other thing. And yeah.
And
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that's a really important point. And as we think about, because the reason why the illicit market is going to continue to be the largest consumer of, or the larger consumer of water relative to the legal market is because of the size, and so when we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, the transition that we're starting to see of a lot more states having this conversation about going legal. And if you've been watching the news since the beginning of 2021, clearly a fuse has been lit, given the number of new states that are very aggressively moving forward with the legalization recommendations. I think one of the things that I think is going to be really compelling to watch is how that transition from unregulated to legal happens, because I don't think it's going to be a one-to-one replacement of, a gallon of water used in the unregulated market will be replaced with a gallon of water used in the unregulated market. I think as the legal market becomes more efficient, it will dramatically reduce the overall load burden of water use of the industry writ large, and that's only to the benefit of kind of jurisdictions, municipalities, particularly those who are facing the most acute water crises, because based on the challenges that particularly the Western states, the Pacific states are facing with longer, more acute, more persistent drought. Kind of getting high value industries that are really that are resource efficient, I think has got to be a critical strategy to ensure not only continued economic growth, but sustainable environmental kind of policy and operations. And so, without even making a blatant statement in advocacy for legalization, I think this is one of the very clear, demonstrable ways in which legalization creates a net benefit, particularly on the environmental side, relative to the unregulated market.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that it all starts with good data, right? Which is one reason we value our partnership with New Frontiers, the emphasis on really actually understanding the cost side of this industry and how to set that baseline and then help, set reduction targets over time based on data. And so, like I gave the example of the incorrect data points that were out there, the way we're going to get correct data is through reporting by producers on their usage, and what we're trying to do is help the industry understand that providing data actually is helpful to them, and while they have a history of that makes sense, that they don't want to share data because they have been not wanting to be revealed for their practices, or not wanting to have what comes out in the data get put back on them in terms of punitive measures. That all makes good sense. But there is another side to that story, which is if the industry volunteers data, and if each individual farm or facility can be protected from a confidentiality standpoint, but the aggregate data, especially as the data set grows and we understand the differences between indoor and outdoor and greenhouse, all of which we cover in the report, as well as the impact of different geographies, right, or climate zone impacts on water usage, then we can really establish much more meaningful benchmarks and baselines and really understand what good performance is, and then help producers move toward that type of performance. And so this is why we, as a nonprofit that is well governed and has a whole set of stakeholders that is, partnering with us to understand these issues and figure out how to measure them in a standardized way. This is why we created the Cannabis Power Score as a resource benchmarking platform that producers can use to voluntarily benchmark their facility in a confidential manner, as well as do streamlined reporting into governments like Massachusetts, which specifies the Power Score as the preferred vehicle for producers to report their compliance reporting through. So we're happy to be that service. It's a free service, and it's there for the industry to use and to benefit from.
Absolutely. It's hard to know, what to improve on or where to make improvements if you don't kind of have those benchmarks defined. Speaking of those benchmarks and improvements, thinking more broadly, in your mind, Derek, what are some of the low-hanging fruit for the cannabis industry to reduce its resource usage, not only in terms of water, but just in general, some of those opportunities to advance sustainability across the supply chain?
Yeah. Well, in a cultivation setting, it sort of starts with the lighting systems that you're installing, because what we're seeing is that HPS lighting, as an example, requires or puts out heat into the room, and then that requires therefore a lot of cooling capacity. And so what happens often is that the HVAC systems are sized for the lighting systems because of the cooling that's required based on the lighting. So you install LEDs and the cooling needs go down significantly. And so you can actually size your HVAC systems smaller because there's less of a cooling load. And that means your CapEx goes down dramatically. And then your OpEx also goes down dramatically because you're not needing to cool as much. And the lighting systems, in the case of LEDs, can save 40+% just in and of themselves as compared to HPS. So it starts there. And then what you have to do is you have to tune your facility based on those systems and the interactive effects between lighting and HVAC. So for example, your watering rates are going to go down based on all of those interactive effects that are going on. The more you can control them and automate them and really be precise about the conditions in the room that you're trying to set, the more you can save, right? And the more resource savings, the more profit.
Absolutely. John, are there, from your findings from the report, are there any other potential ways for cannabis industry operators in the cultivation side to advance sustainability that are, more of the easily accessible solutions?
Yeah, so I think, Derek has covered, I think, what the two big ones are. Energy is clearly the largest area where, one, there's massive opportunity for improved efficiency, but also two, because so much cannabis is being grown indoors or in mixed light facilities, the overall impact of greater efficiency in energy use is very, very consequential. But when we began our collaboration with RII, the common wisdom was cannabis was the most energy intensive crop in our agricultural economy. The transition to LEDs, to more efficient HVAC systems, to cogeneration on site, all of these, I think, are steps that can help reduce dramatically the energy footprint of the legal regulated market. Now, beyond cultivation, though, I actually think that there's one area of this industry that is not being discussed enough, but is also going to be a massive opportunity for improvements in sustainability. And that, to me, is packaging. Regulations make, unfortunately, the packaging requirements extraordinarily cumbersome. And that coupled with the fact that cannabis products are really small. So how do you make them stand out on shelves? You can really big packaging, even though what's inside the packaging ends up being tiny. And there's not enough of a discussion happening around one trying to scale down the total amount of packaging being created, because so much of it is single-use packaging. It's not ending up back with the producers or retailers from where it's sourced. But also to greater kind of sustainability. So using more recyclable products or more reusable products, whether it's in vapes and some of these electronic devices. I think that's going to be one of the next big stories about sustainability in this space. And much like energy use or water on the cultivation side, I think that's going to be a critically important issue to address while the industry is still in its infancy. We're not going to be wanting to have this conversation about billions of discarded vape cartridges 5-10 years from now.
Absolutely, that's an excellent point.
Perhaps we do a waste report next, huh, John?
Right. I'm up for that. Absolutely up for that.
I look forward to it. And so, Derek, before we close out the show, are there any final thoughts or any key takeaways or exciting new projects other than a potential packaging report that you'd like to discuss with our listeners or share with our listeners?
Yeah, I appreciate that. We publish, so we the heart of RII is really our technical advisory council, and what we do is arrange our technical advisory council of multidisciplinary folks from governments, utilities, cultivators, engineers, architects, contractors, manufacturers of technology, bring all those folks together into working groups on specific topics. So what guided this project, the water report, was a water working group that we've referred to, but it includes category leaders in grow media and other aspects, cultivators, government officials, everybody just rolling up their sleeves. And it's that collective effort of trying to figure this out that's how we're going to get there. And so we have our technical advisory council in all these groups, and they generally produce things that are peer reviewed that are valuable guidance to the market. So if you go to our website, our resources page, there's several best practices guides on, for example, how to cultivate efficiently with LED lighting, how to operate HVAC systems most effectively. Coming down the line this year, as we're now done with the water report, we'll have a more comprehensive policy primer for governments to help them understand how to think about energy and environmental issues. And we're not offering prescriptive guidance. We're offering more like, if you are in an area that has water constraints, you might think about that, approaching the industry from this standpoint. A huge recommendation in that policy primer will be required reporting on these issues so that we can capture more data so that everybody can benefit from, like I said, that aggregate understanding of what's going on and what's best practice. So we also, we'll be producing a controls and automation best practices guide later this year, as well as a design and construction best practices guide. And we'll increasingly bring learnings, as I was saying earlier, from other agricultural sectors, as well as help cannabis bring learnings, because there's a ton of innovation going on here, particularly around lighting, et cetera, that can inform other agricultural markets. And I think it's just another dimension of destigmatizing this plant and this industry by connecting it to those larger agricultural sustainability conversations and helping it be an active force in those dialogues.
Absolutely. And thank you, Derek, and Resource Innovation Institute for all the work that you do. And for you, Derek, for joining us on this episode today. And also thank you to all of our listeners for joining us at CannaWeek. To access your complimentary copy of Cannabis H20, Water Use and Sustainability and Cannabis Cultivation, visit newfrontierdata.com/Cannabis H20. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast. I'm your host, Abby Kaufman, and I'll see you next week.